The sting was not one of a shattered heart, but of a thoroughly demolished pride. Lady Elinor Daventry stood in the shadowy corner of St. George's, Hanover Square, the scent of lilies and beeswax thick in the air, and felt the cold, sharp-edged humiliation seep into her very bones. Before the altar where she was meant to be standing, stood Mr. Alastair Finchley. Her Alastair for the last 6 months, clasping the hand of her second cousin, Miss Beatrice Croft. The betrayal had been executed with military precision, the news delivered not by her faithless betrothed, but by a tittering maid just as Elinor was preparing to don her wedding gown. Her own family, mortified and eager to avoid the scandal of a jilted daughter, had all but shoved her into the carriage. For the heir, her mother had wept, but Elinor knew it was to get her out of the house, away from the pitying stares and the whispers that felt louder than church bells. So here she was, in a church on her wedding day, watching another woman marry her fiancé. The irony was so profound it was almost amusing. Almost. A movement to her right caught her attention. Another figure lingered in the opposing transept, a dark, brooding silhouette against the sunlit-stained glass. A gentleman, tall and broad-shouldered, his posture rigid with a tension that mirrored her own. As the newly proclaimed Mr. and Mrs. Finchley turned to parade down the aisle, faces glowing with triumph and relief, the gentleman's gaze met Elinor's. It was not a glance of curiosity, but one of shared, stark understanding. He too was in exile here. He too was bleeding from a wound inflicted by the spectacle before them. Driven by an impulse she could not name, a desperate, reckless need to defy the crushing weight of her ruin, Elinor did not look away. She held his gaze, a silent communication passing between them in the hushed, celebratory air. As the happy couple swept past, followed by the gawking congregation, the church emptied, leaving only the two of them, anchored in their respective pools of shadow. He was the one to break the stillness. He walked toward her, his steps measured on the stone floor. As he drew nearer, she saw that his eyes were a stormy gray. His jaw clenched so tightly a muscle ticked in his cheek. He was handsome in a severe, unforgiving way, all sharp angles and restrained power. "You seem as though you have as little fondness for this union as I do," he said, his voice a low baritone that vibrated in the quiet space. Elinor lifted her chin, her pride the only armor she had left. "The groom was to have been my husband." A flicker of something, surprise, perhaps respect, crossed his features. "And the bride was to have been my wife." The shared revelation hung between them, absurd and devastating. They were two halves of a broken whole, discarded on the same day, in the same church. "Lord Sebastian Thorne," he said, executing a curt bow. "Lady Elinor Daventry. Our mutual misfortune appears to be complete, Lady Elinor." He surveyed her, his gaze missing nothing. The unshed tears she refused to let fall, the defiant set of her shoulders, the stark pallor of her face. "What do you intend to do now?" "I have not the faintest idea," she admitted, the truth tasting like ash. "Return home, I suppose. Endure the whispers. Become a cautionary tale for debutantes with overly optimistic natures." "A bleak future," he remarked, his eyes narrowing in thought. "I find myself in a similarly precarious position. My estate, Blackwood Hall, is entailed. The terms of the entailment require that I marry before my 30th birthday, which is precisely 1 week from today, or the title and lands pass to a distant, dissolute cousin. I had believed today would secure my legacy." He gave a short, bitter laugh. "It seems I was mistaken." An idea, wild and utterly mad, began to form in the wreckage of Elinor's mind. It was impulsive, born of desperation and a fierce, survivalist instinct. He needed a wife to secure his inheritance. She needed a husband to salvage her reputation. They were both standing in a church, on the day they were meant to be married. "It need not be a mistake," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Lord Thorne's eyebrows rose. "I beg your pardon. You require a wife. I require a husband. We are both here." The vicar is still at the altar, looking rather confused. She gestured to the clergyman, who was shuffling papers and casting nervous glances in their direction. It would be a business arrangement, of course. A union of mutual convenience. We would present a united front to the Tun, and in doing so, solve both our immediate problems. He stared at her as if she had grown a second head. You are proposing marriage. Me. A man you met 3 minutes ago. Is it any more irrational than marrying a man you believed you knew, only for him to abandon you at the altar for another? She countered, her green eyes blazing. This, at least, would be an honest transaction. No false promises. No feigned affection. A shield for you, a shelter for me. Sebastian Thorne was a man of logic and calculation, but his carefully ordered world had just been upended. This woman, with her fiery spirit and startling proposition, represented chaos. Yet within that chaos he saw a brutal, elegant logic. She was right. A marriage of convenience would silence the gossips, secure his estate, and save her from social oblivion. It was cold. It was clinical. It was perfect. He offered her his arm, a slow, deliberate smile touching his lips, the first genuine expression she had seen on his face. It transformed him from severe to dangerously compelling. Very well, Lady Elinor. Let us make a convenience of each other. The vicar, one Mr. Adams, was understandably flustered. But my lord, my lady, the banns, the license. Sebastian produced a special license from the inner pocket of his coat. I obtained it for my previous intended. It is, as you see, still valid. Mr. Adams peered at the document. His brow furrowed. This is highly irregular. So is being jilted, Elinor said softly, her voice laced with a steel thread. We would be most grateful for your discretion and your service. Something in her tone, a mixture of vulnerability and iron will, decided the matter. The ceremony was a hollow, rushed affair. There were no family members, no flowers strewn in their path, no joyous peal of bells. They exchanged vows in near whispers, their words echoing in the vast, empty church. When Lord Thorne, her husband, slipped a plain gold band onto her finger, it felt cold and foreign. When he was instructed to kiss the bride, he leaned in and brushed his lips against her cheek, a brief, impersonal contact that sent an unexpected shiver down her spine. They exited the church as Lord and Lady Thorne, into a world that had not witnessed their transformation. Elinor's lady's maid, Mary, who had been waiting in the carriage, gaped as Sebastian handed Elinor in and gave the direction to his London townhouse. Your family, he said once they were seated across from each other, the carriage jolting into motion. We must inform them. It will be a shock. They will be relieved, Elinor corrected him, looking out the window at the passing streets. The scandal of a jilting is superseded by the surprise of a marriage. To a marquess, no less. My mother will be ecstatic once she recovers from the astonishment. The visit to the Daventry residence was a scene of high drama. Her mother swooned. Her father blustered. But as Elinor predicted, the sheer rank of her new husband acted as a powerful restorative. The narrative was quickly rewritten. A secret, whirlwind romance with the dashing Marquess of Thorne, a private ceremony to avoid the fuss. It was a fiction, but it was a palatable one. From there, they went to Sebastian's townhouse, a grand, imposing building in Mayfair. The staff was assembled in the foyer. Sebastian introduced her with a detached air. This is Lady Thorne, my wife. You will accord her every respect and obedience. The butler, a man named Hughes with a face like a stone mask, bowed deeply. Of course, my lord. My lady. And so, in the space of a single afternoon, Elinor Daventry's life was utterly dismantled and reassembled. She was no longer a jilted woman. She was the Marchioness of Thorne. She had a husband, a title, and a formidable new enemy. The woman who was now her husband's former almost wife, and the man who was her own. The next fortnight was a masterclass in performance. They attended balls, soirees, and operas, a perfectly matched pair. Sebastian was all polished gallantry, his hand a constant, guiding presence on the small of Elinor's back. Elinor was the picture of serene elegance, her smiles perfectly timed, her laughter never forced. They were the talk of the ton, their secret romance, the most delicious piece of gossip of the season. In private, however, their existence was one of careful negotiation. They inhabited the large townhouse like two opposing diplomats sharing a neutral embassy. They took meals together in a silence that was, at first, profoundly awkward. They learned each other's habits through observation. He was an early riser, a voracious reader of political tracts. She preferred the quiet of the evening and devoured novels and scientific journals. Their first true test came at the Ridgely Ball, the first major event where they would encounter both Alistair and Beatrice. Elinor felt a knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach as they entered the glittering ballroom. "Courage, my lady," Sebastian murmured, his breath warm against her ear as he leaned in, for all the world a doting husband sharing an intimate secret. "Remember, we hold the higher ground. They are the ones who acted with dishonor." She nodded, drawing strength from his solid presence beside her. When the inevitable meeting occurred, it was a masterpiece of social swordsmanship. "Lord Thorne." "Lady Thorne," Alistair Finchley said, his face a comical mask of confusion and chagrin. Beatrice, clinging to his arm, looked positively green with envy. "Mr. Finchley." "Mrs. Finchley," Sebastian replied, his tone dripping with icy civility. "I believe congratulations are in order for you both as well, though your own nuptials were, of course, somewhat more public." Elinor smiled, a slow, gracious curve of her lips that did not reach her eyes. "Yes, we so preferred the intimacy of our own ceremony. It allows one to focus on what truly matters. The vows." She let her gaze rest pointedly on Alistair, who had the decency to blush. It was a victory, small and sweet. As Sebastian led her away for their first dance, a waltz, he looked down at her with something akin to approval. "You handled that exquisitely." "As did you," she replied, her hand in his feeling less strange than it had before. "Your tone was perfectly calibrated between congratulatory and condescending." He spun her into the turn, his arm a firm band around her waist. For a moment, surrounded by music and light, the pretense felt almost real. She was acutely aware of the strength in his frame, the scent of sandalwood and bergamot that clung to him. She saw the way other women watched him, a mixture of admiration and longing, and felt a peculiar possessive thrill. But the moment shattered as they left the dance floor. A tall, willowy blonde with cold blue eyes intercepted them. Lady Cassandra Vane. Elinor had heard the whispers. She was the diamond of the season, and she had set her cap firmly at Sebastian before his ill-fated engagement to Beatrice. "Sebastian," she purred, ignoring Elinor completely. What a surprising turn of events. And so, hastily arranged. Her eyes swept over Elinor with dismissive cruelty. One might almost think it a marriage of desperation. Sebastian's face hardened. "One would be mistaken, Cassandra. Love, as they say, is often impulsive." He tightened his grip on Elinor's hand. "If you will excuse us." He guided Elinor away, his body tense. The easy camaraderie of moments before had vanished, replaced by a familiar, guarded distance. Life at the Thorne townhouse settled into a strained rhythm. Elinor took over the management of the household with a quiet efficiency that impressed even the stoic Hughes. She and Sebastian developed a system of coded communication for public events. A slight pressure of his hand meant, "We should circulate." A certain tilt of her head signaled, "Rescue me from this bore." They were becoming a proficient team, yet the chasm between them remained. They knew nothing of each other's inner worlds. Elinor had no idea why Sebastian, a man of clear intellect and strength, had chosen the vapid Beatrice Croft. Sebastian did not understand the deep-seated fear of powerlessness that drove Elinor's fierce independence, born from watching her mother's life be entirely dictated by her father's whims. One rainy afternoon, a letter arrived for Sebastian. He read it at the breakfast table, his expression growing increasingly grim. "Bad news?" Elinor asked, setting down her teacup. "It is from my steward at Blackwood," he said, folding the letter with sharp, precise movements. "A matter of a disputed tenant lease. It requires my personal attention. We will depart for the country at the end of the week." "We." The word slipped out before she could stop it. He looked up, his grey eyes meeting hers. "You are the Marchioness of Thorne. The tenants will expect to see their lady. It is part of the arrangement, is it not?" "Of course," she said, her voice even. "I did not mean to suggest otherwise." The journey to Blackwood Hall in Derbyshire was long and silent. The landscape shifted from the cultivated prettiness of London's outskirts to the wild, dramatic peaks of the Peak District. When the carriage finally rolled up the long, tree-lined drive, Elinor caught her breath. Blackwood Hall was not a graceful manor. It was a fortress of dark stone, built into the side of a mist-shrouded hill, its turrets and gables stark against the leaden sky. It was beautiful in a way that was austere and slightly intimidating, much like its master. The interior was no less imposing. Vast, echoing rooms furnished with heavy, ancient pieces and portraits of stern-faced Thornes glowering down from the walls. Felt lonely. Felt like him. Life in the country was a different kind of performance. Here they were not just a united front for the ton, but for the entire estate. They toured the tenant farms together. Elinor, drawing on a natural empathy her society life had rarely required, spoke with the farmers' wives about their children and their ailments, her gentle manner instantly winning their trust. Sebastian dealt with the business of the land. His decisions firm but fair. They fell into a new routine, a domestic pantomime for the benefit of the servants and tenants. It was during this time that the carefully constructed walls between them began to develop cracks. One evening, after a long day resolving the tenant dispute, they sat in the library. A fire crackled in the great hearth, casting dancing shadows across the shelves of leather-bound books. The silence between them was no longer entirely uncomfortable, but contemplative. "You were very good with Mrs. Hodges today," Sebastian remarked, swirling the brandy in his glass. "She has been difficult with every steward and landlord she has ever known. Yet she smiled for you." Elinor looked up from her book. "She is not difficult. She is frightened. Her husband is ill, and she fears being turned out. She needed reassurance, not a legal argument." He studied her, truly looked at her, as if seeing her for the first time. "I would have approached it as a legal argument." "I know," she said with a small smile. "It is why you brought me along, is it not? To provide the softer touch." "I brought you along because it was expected," he said. His honesty a blunt instrument. But then he added, quieter, "But your softer touch was effective." Another evening, he found her in the music room, her fingers tracing the keys of a neglected pianoforte. She was not playing, just remembering. "Do you play?" he asked from the doorway, startling her. "I did. Once. My father said it was a frivolous pursuit for a lady who needed to secure a good match." She closed the keyboard cover with a soft thud. "I have not played in years." "Play for me now," he said, the command softened by a note of curiosity. Hesitantly, she opened the cover again. She played a piece by Mozart, her fingers stiff at first, then gaining fluidity as muscle memory took over. It was not a perfect performance, but it was filled with a longing and passion that her public persona never revealed. When she finished, the last note hanging in the air, she found him watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "You play with great feeling," he said, his voice rough. "It is easier to feel things when no one is watching," she replied, her heart hammering against her ribs. The turning point came with a fever. A particularly virulent strain swept through the village, and soon it reached the hall. Elinor, throwing herself into the role of lady of the manor, organized the distribution of medicines and broths, visiting the sick tenants herself. Sebastian forbade it. "It is too great a risk. You will fall ill." "It is my duty," she insisted, her eyes flashing. "They are our people. Would you have them think their lady is too fine to share their hardships?" "I would have my wife not die of a putrid fever for the sake of appearances," he retorted, his control snapping. The argument was cut short when Elinor, ignoring his command, returned from the village one evening shivering and pale. By morning she was burning with fever, delirious. Sebastian's world, so carefully ordered and controlled, narrowed to the four walls of her bedchamber. He dismissed the terrified maid and the bustling housekeeper. He sent for the doctor, but he himself did not leave her side. He bathed her forehead with cool cloths, forced sips of water between her cracked lips, and held her hand as she thrashed and muttered in her sleep. She called out for Alistair once, a broken whisper of betrayal that made Sebastian's gut clench with an emotion he refused to name. But she also called out his name, Sebastian, a question and a plea that undid him completely. He saw her then, not as his convenient wife, but as Elinor. Brave, stubborn, fiercely compassionate Elinor, who played the piano with repressed passion and faced down social ruin with her chin held high. He saw the vulnerability she hid from the world, and he felt a protective, possessive fury rise within him. He would not lose her. He could not. On the third night the crisis passed. The fever broke, leaving her weak and exhausted, but lucid. She opened her eyes to find him slumped in a chair beside her bed. His hair disheveled, his clothes wrinkled, fast asleep. His hand still held hers. She did not pull away. She watched the rise and fall of his chest, the way the early morning light softened the harsh lines of his face. This man, her virtual stranger of a husband, had nursed her through a fever. He had stayed. The realization settled over her, warm and profound. When he stirred and found her awake, his relief was palpable. Elinor. Her name was a prayer on his lips. "You stayed," she whispered. "Where else would I be?" he replied, his gray eyes soft, the storm within them momentarily stilled. He helped her sit up, his touch gentle, reverent. He fed her broth, his actions devoid of their usual detachment. The silence between them was now charged, thick with unspoken words. "Why did you propose to Beatrice?" she asked softly, breaking the quiet. He sighed, the sound weary. "Because she was beautiful, suitable, and manageable. I thought I wanted a wife who would not disrupt my life. A placid, decorative presence." He looked at her, a wry, self-deprecating smile on his face. "I was a fool. And why did you agree to marry me?" she asked, her heart in her throat. He reached out, his fingers gently tracing the line of her jaw. "Because in that church you looked at me not with pity, but with a challenge. You were the most disruptive force I had ever encountered, and in that moment of chaos, you were the only thing that made sense." It was not a declaration of love, but it was a confession of need, of respect, of a connection that went far deeper than convenience. He leaned forward slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away. She did not. His lips met hers, and this time, it was not a perfunctory brush of skin against skin. It was a kiss, tentative at first, then deepening with a pent-up hunger that shook them both. It was a kiss that held all the unspoken conversations, the shared trials, the burgeoning respect, and the fierce, unexpected attraction that had been simmering beneath the surface for weeks. The arrangement was no longer just convenient. It had become profoundly, terrifyingly real. The return to London 2 months later was a homecoming of a different sort. They returned not as strangers bound by a contract, but as a couple bound by a shared secret and a newfound intimacy. The pretense for the ton continued, but now the touches were not just for show. The smiles were not just practiced. The heat in Sebastian's gaze when he looked at her across a crowded room was entirely genuine. The final test of their union came at the season's grandest event, the Carlton House Ball. It was there that Lady Cassandra Vane, seething with jealous resentment, made her move. Cornering Elinor near a potted fern while Sebastian was fetching her a glass of lemonade, she unleashed her venom. "Everyone knows the truth, you know," Cassandra hissed, her smile saccharine. "That yours was a patched-up, desperate affair. That he only married you because he was humiliated, and you were ruined." Do not think for a moment he sees you as anything more than a necessary inconvenience. The old fears, the insecurities that Elinor had thought conquered, rose like ghosts. She felt the color drain from her face. But before she could form a retort, Sebastian was there. He had not gotten the lemonade. He had seen the exchange from across the room and had come to her side with the speed of a predator. "Cassandra," he said, his voice dangerously quiet, yet carrying in the sudden lull around them. "You will apologize to my wife." Cassandra fluttered her fan. "I was merely engaging in conversation, Sebastian." "You were insulting the Marchioness of Thorne," he corrected, his arm slipping around Elinor's waist, pulling her firmly against his side. The gesture was one of pure public possession. "The woman I love." A collective gasp went through the nearby crowd. Elinor's head whipped around to look at him. "Love. This marriage," Sebastian continued, his voice rising so all could hear, "was the best decision of my life. It was not born of desperation, but of clarity. I saw in Elinor a strength, a spirit, and a heart that I did not know I was missing. She is not my convenience. She is my choice, my partner, and I will not tolerate any disrespect toward her." The silence was absolute. Cassandra looked as if she had been slapped. The fiction of their marriage shattered, not to reveal a hollow arrangement, but to reveal something far more powerful and authentic. Alistair and Beatrice, standing nearby, looked on, their faces a mixture of shock and dawning understanding. They saw the way Sebastian looked at Elinor, not as a possession but as an equal. They saw the way Elinor leaned into his embrace, her eyes shining with unshed tears and a fierce, triumphant love. The mask was off. The performance was over. Later that night, in the quiet sanctuary of their bedchamber, Elinor turned to him. The sounds of the ball still echoed faintly in her ears, but all she could hear was the beating of her own heart. "Did you mean it?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "What you said to Cassandra?" Sebastian cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs stroking her cheeks. His gray eyes were clear, earnest, stripped bare of all their former storminess. "Every word," he said. "It started as an arrangement, Elinor. A transaction between two wounded people. But somewhere between your defiance in that church and your courage in that sickroom, it became the truest thing in my life. I did not know I was capable of loving someone as I love you. It is terribly inconvenient," he added with a ghost of his old smile, "and I would not have it any other way." Tears of joy finally spilled down her cheeks. "Oh, Sebastian, I was so afraid to hope. I thought I was just a solution to a problem." "You are the solution to every problem I never knew I had," he murmured, leaning his forehead against hers. "I love you, Elinor." "And I love you," she breathed. "My husband." Their third kiss was not one of impulse or convenience, or even newfound passion. It was a vow, a seal upon a promise that had been written in the ashes of their old lives, and had now blossomed into something beautiful, resilient, and entirely wonderfully real. The stranger she had married was a stranger no more. He was her home,